rights, so the magazine will be completely empty. It'll be a coloring book. But curiously, 1 year on, it's exactly what US readers want. We have obviously a very interesting few months ahead of us as to where we go and who will end up in the White House. But I think it's exactly what Americans want right now. There is such a dearth of foreign news, and all you read about, if you look at the US trade journals, is another news bureau has closed in the from one of the major newspapers. And we get so much correspondence from US readers who say, yeah, I live in a city. We used to have 3 newspapers. Now we have 2 newspapers. Well, no, we had 2 newspapers. Now we're down to 1 newspaper. We used to get CNN International. We only get CNN Domestic now. I have no idea what's going on in the world. So I love The Economist on one side for telling me what's happened. I like Monocle because it gives me a forward view as to where the world's going. And we want to be able to forge those relationships with readers all over the world. And likewise, as I was saying earlier, we're very tough on PRs. And there's been no shortage of car companies saying, well, please come to California and test drive this new vehicle. It's like, well, it's not what we do in our magazine. Happy to come to California, but it's not going to guarantee any editorial coverage. Oh, well, if you don't do any editorial coverage, then we're going to pull all of our advertising from your magazine. Go ahead. That's the type of relationship that we have to have now. It's also, I think, one of the important things about being global, that we don't just have to rely on the budgets of Germany or the UK or the United States, but that we're able to develop very deep relationships in Japan or Korea. So in that sense, we also spread our risk from an editorial point of view. And I think we're quite optimistic. A journalist from Der Spiegel who did a story about us, I think it was last week or the week before last, said that nothing bad ever happens in the magazine. I don't think that's entirely true. We don't go through the day with rose-tinted glasses, but also I don't think we're down on the world either. And she asked me, because you never really take a critical view on things, and I said, I would actually rather just let our silence speak volumes. I think there's enough going on in terms of blog culture right now where people kick the shit out of brands, people all day long, that I think that maybe that's the role of that media to do that. I think the fact that if we're quite silent about something, it doesn't mean, of course, that we don't give Mr. Mugabe a hard time when we cover Zimbabwe, obviously not. But at the same time, I don't think we need to spend time, whether it's reviewing books. I think we want to just review what you want to read, as opposed to whether something was horrendous or whether it was fabulous. I just want to go through some design ideas. I was talking about the sense of craft and how we work. We work with a lot of etching, and I know a lot of this can be done on Mac, but we have a gentleman who's just on a very small island on the Danish side of the border, just beyond Sylt, and he etches stamps and does all of the banknotes for the Danish government still. So he's still etching in lead for us when we do a variety of our stories. Maybe it sounds a bit Luddite-ish and a bit fogey-ish of us, but I think it's actually wonderful in a digital era to also be able to exploit everything that a Mac can offer us. But I think it's also wonderful to work with an 80-year-old gentleman who's still sitting there with his pick and his lead and is able to render great images for us. As I mentioned, the affairs section of our magazine is obviously constantly spinning the globe and sending people around the world. And it is that spotting the opportunity and whether it's a positive or dangerous one. But that's what we do. This is, apologies, that was Munich, which we named as our #1 city last year, much to the delight of other German cities. And we'll be repeating that again this year in July, August. And we'll see who wins. Just showing an approach to reportage that we do. This is just an example of something which is in the current issue where we go up on the borders of Finland. So it was also looking at the expansion of Schengen, but also the longest border that the EU shares at the moment. And it was going out on patrol with Finland's border guards. Some examples of our work. This is our style leader section, which is where we deconstruct the style of various leaders around the world, and has been, from a PR point of view, quite extraordinary because it generates a lot of press every issue. And as I mentioned, these are what are etched by Mr. Mork up in the North Sea. Our Brands Explained page. Many things I'm showing you now are just things that we repeat every single issue. And I think that's the importance, again, of developing a very strong brand, that sense of repetition. On one side, keeping it fresh in terms of where you cast your eye every issue, but also having a series of things which are unique that other magazines aren't doing, and brings people back again and again. So this is where we take a snapshot of everyday life, something as mundane as being at Cope in Zurich, but then where everything is numbered, we then deconstruct all of those things that you might see in daily life, not realizing that someone who makes conveyor belts at supermarkets is actually originally a Slovenian company, and they've got sales in the billions, and they're probably the second biggest driving force in the Slovenian economy. Not highly useful information every day, but terribly valuable at a good dinner party. When I spoke about spotting the opportunity, this is also a statement against the likes of Starbucks as well. I think sometimes we can take a very pro-globalization stance, but also an anti-one. And this is looking at a new concept out of Copenhagen called Emery's, which has been around for some time now, but how they've really gone and reinvented and given a very Danish spin to what Starbucks might be doing. Piece on Deutsche Bahn and how Deutsche Bahn is also trying to exploit the slow movement and their drive with overnight trains. This has actually become our most successful film that we've also done online. If anyone's going to Copenhagen in the coming weeks, and I'm sure some of you have been, there's a place called Royal Cafe, which is behind the Illems Bolighus department store. And they developed this, you can see in the lower right-hand side, something called smooshies, which is like Danish smørrebrød, but sort of served in sushi sizes. And it was just interesting because, here's a gentleman who started his business. We put this in the magazine, and he now has every major Japanese department store beating a path to his door to license them. So it's quite interesting as well. And it's a wonderful friction that the magazine has, that suddenly you can publish something like this. We're the first people to do the story. And this man's not expanding his business to open up a place in Aarhus or in Hamburg. The next place, and where the world has jumped on it, is Japan, and then his next deals are Singapore. And I think that's a great thing about the power of having a global media brand, I think, which also hits the right desks of whether marketing people, CEOs, etc., in other markets. Coverage of India, aviation is a running theme, and of course, there's a huge shortage of pilots around the world at the moment, as we know. At the same time, there's also a massive shortage in flight attendants as well. So this is looking at flight attendant school in India, a piece on Japanese pop. And our culture section as well, I think we get a lot of letters saying, why don't you do fine art? You need to add an opera section to your magazine. And our response is always, our culture section's really evolved into a media section more than anything else. Of course, we touch on art. We don't cover opera. Not that we wouldn't, but I think that we're also not necessarily versed in that environment. I think we also want to be comfortable whenever we put anything on page, that it's something that we know that we can also stand behind. And as I said, the deeper you go into the magazine, of course, you get to the design section. And we set ourselves a bit of a task, which is quite interesting, that I think fashion magazines, something's very curious about fashion magazines. People who do the styling and fashion titles, I feel, are not out there to sell clothes. They're not out there to actually drive the reader to find something fabulous to go and buy. I also feel they're not out there to support the advertisers. And I said one thing which is very interesting, if you look at the Japanese market, and we spend a lot of time looking at the Japanese newsstand, because I think we've all had very difficult, animated, interesting discussions, probably with our media owners, about why are you cutting the trim size of our magazine? Why are you putting our magazine on shitty paper now? All of these things which has happened in publishing. And of course, it's because we have to cut costs. It's because we have to put more money on the web. And we have gotten to the point, though, where I think a lot of magazines actually look like they're not even as good. I've got to look at the sponsors. A Thomas Cook brochure, potentially, that you'd find in a travel agent. And I think it's an enormous problem. And you're wondering why people aren't buying your magazines right now. Well, you're putting out something which is like a Deutsche Bank brochure. And it's not acceptable. And that's actually why we brought out a magazine which felt much more bookish. The only way that magazines are going to be able to compete against this and what happens in an increasingly wired world is because they're physical. It's because they're tactile. It's because they smell great.